Threats, intimidation, and outright lies. These have been the tools that Russian President Vladimir Putin has used throughout his reign, and particularly following his invasion of Ukraine, to attempt to cajole the collective West into doing what he wants. Whenever a red line threatens to be crossed, Putin has a hissy fit, threatening everything from war to the use of nuclear weapons. But finally, the West is waking up. NATO, recognizing its own status as a military behemoth, can call Putin's nuclear bluff. As tensions look set to explode, NATO finds itself in a position where it can make Putin back down by forcing him to put his money where his mouth is. That's according to The Telegraph's Con Coughlin, who said that the key to forcing Putin to back down lies in US President Donald Trump having the will to leverage America's military along with the full force of NATO to back Putin into a corner. Left with no options, Coughlin argues, Putin's campaign of aggression will be repulsed and Ukraine's sovereignty can be maintained. Coughlin points out that Putin's bark is often much worse than his bite, especially when it comes to the threats that he flings toward the West, often for its role in supporting Ukraine and repelling Russia's invasion. One of the Russian President Vladimir Putin's less convincing tactics during the long-running Ukraine conflict has been to threaten the West with doomsday scenarios whenever he finds himself in a fix, Coughlin points out, and there's plenty of evidence to show that he's right. Ever since the beginning of the war, much was made about Russia's so-called red lines. These were the actions that the West could take that might lead to Putin escalating the war beyond what Russia had already done. From the outset, the likes of the US sending tanks into Ukraine was a red line. So too was the prospect of Western fighter jets such as F-16s entering Ukraine. Every time the conversation turned to even the smallest prospect that these types of weapons might enter Ukraine, Putin would threaten escalation up to and including transforming a conventional war into a nuclear one. The threats came so often that United 24 media compiled a list of the many times that Russia has accused the West of escalation, and then made vague or sometimes even overt threats of nuclear war in response. Russia has made far too many of these types of threats for us to discuss them all, with the United 24 media list offering almost 80 separate instances since Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. But among the threats have been warnings of nuclear and hypersonic missile deployment if Finland and Sweden join NATO, claims that attacks on Crimea will ignite a Judgment Day response, a threat from one of Putin's former advisors made to the UK that nukes will be used if the UK doesn't keep its nose out of Russia's business. Many of these threats were made within the first 8 months of the war. There have been many more since. And in fairness to Russia, it does have the nuclear muscle to back these threats up, were it ever to follow through. In May, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists estimated that Russia has around 4,309 warheads for its strategic and non-strategic forces. The country has also increased its stockpile of non-strategic or shorter-range warheads, which are nukes that aren't pre-aimed at a particular target and can be used as and when needed. Russia also has a full nuclear triad, with 870 of its deployed warheads being land-based, 640 installed in submarines, and around 200 located at the country's heavy bomber bases. The sheer size of that collection makes Putin's threats credible, at least in terms of Russia being capable of carrying out what it claims to be capable of doing. And those threats have worked before. Coughlin specifically calls out the Joe Biden administration for not doing enough to help Ukraine repel the Russian threat much earlier. Other outlets have done the same. In October 2024, The Guardian's Simon Tisdall called Biden's failure to contain the Ukraine war one of the former US president's biggest blunders. Though Biden succeeded in preventing a hot war between Russia and NATO from being triggered, his piecemeal and lackluster approach to arming Ukraine suggested a man who thought that type of war was possible in the first place, Tisdall argues. The Atlantic Council takes a similarly critical view in a November 2024 article in which it claimed that Biden made a mess of the Ukraine war by treating it as a crisis to be managed rather than a war that needed to be won. It notes that it had taken 2.5 years for Biden to grant Ukraine permission to use long-range missiles such as ATACMS inside Russia. And even then, that permission was only extended to certain targets. The same outlet implies that Biden ended up falling for the Great Russian Lie, stating, "In fact, the United States had greatly overestimated Russian might. Instead of unleashing shock and awe, Putin's military was a shoddy instrument. It had ample firepower, but was also hindered by corruption, uneven morale, command and control shortcomings, and logistical problems." We'll be coming back to these points later in the video. But the main point being made here is that Putin and his cronies have flung threats around freely, both because intimidation is the name of their game, and because those threats have proven themselves to work in the past. And Russia is at it again. On December 2nd, Euronews reported that Putin has claimed that Russia is ready for a fight if Europe wants to start a war. Putin made this threat soon after meeting with US envoys in Moscow and seemed to be trying to use it to prevent Europe from taking a more active part in peace negotiations. If Europe decides to go to war with Russia and actually starts a war, a situation could very quickly come where Moscow simply has no one to negotiate with. Translation: Russia will destroy Europe if the two go to war. CNBC also reported on Putin's meeting with the US, noting that once again Russia's leader has refused to agree to anything less than the maximalist demands he's been making since he launched his invasion. The outlet also offered up another of Putin's quotes, noting that he told journalists, "We're not going to war with Europe. I've said that 100 times, but if Europe suddenly wants to fight us and starts, we're ready right now." Again, the message is clear, and it's that Putin wants Europe to believe that it doesn't stand a chance if it even considers going to war with Russia. Putin won't start the fight, which is a rich claim to make given the dozens of hybrid warfare assaults Russia has launched on Europe's NATO members in 2025 alone, but if the fight starts, Russia will be the ones to finish it. However, there's a problem for Putin, and it's the one that Coughlin highlights in his article. Putin's threats may have worked in dissuading the West from doing more to help Ukraine in the past. But despite all of the supposed red lines and the many threats, nuclear or otherwise, Russia hasn't once followed through on any claims of major escalation for what the West has done during the war. It's about time that NATO realizes that, Coughlin argues, stating in his article. But rather than being intimidated by Putin's latest bully boy threats, NATO leaders need to understand that even in the event of a direct military confrontation with Russia, they unquestionably have the upper hand. This is far from a new argument, though it's one that bears repeating as Putin has renewed his threats against almost all of Europe. We've mentioned red lines several times, and that's because almost every single one that was in place when the Ukraine war started has been crossed. Western countries have sent tanks to Ukraine in their hundreds, F-16s have taken to the skies, and they're being joined by French Mirage and potentially Swedish Gripen jets, and yet the nuclear bombs haven't flown, and the full-blown war that Russia has threatened so many times hasn't come to pass. Russia's failure to follow through on its threats has even become a source of mockery as far back as September 2024. That's when the UK Defence Journal published an article stating that Russia seems to have more red lines than troops, and that these lines seem to shift more frequently than a London fog. The supposedly unbreakable barriers that Russia erected have instead proven themselves extremely flexible. Every time a red line has been crossed, Russia has created another one and said, "If you cross this one, you'll get a response." Inevitably, that new line has been crossed, and the cycle repeats over and over again. Also, in a September 2024 article, the Atlantic Council said that Putin has gotten himself entangled in his own web of discredited red lines. It reported on a threat that Putin made about Western countries allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles inside Russia. We know now that Ukraine can and has been doing that since November 2024. But at the time, Putin's threat was undermined by the fact that Ukraine was routinely using Western missiles in its attacks on occupied Crimea. Do you remember our mention of Crimea earlier in the video? Attacking that peninsula with Western weapons was a red line too, and it's one that was crossed with no serious response from Russia. Putin has a problem with following through, which brings us back to his most recent threat. Russia's leader says that the country is ready for a war with Europe, which would essentially amount to a war against all of NATO. After all, NATO and the European Union have 23 members in common, and NATO's Article 5 means that any of those members being attacked brings the rest of NATO into a war. The reality is much different. Russia isn't ready for a war with NATO, and that's why NATO should be calling Putin's bluff on his latest threat. That's not just Coughlin's opinion. On December 2nd, United 24 media reported that an unnamed NATO official has claimed that Russia is far from being ready for war with Europe or NATO. Putin may say he's ready for war, but when Putin says something, it often doesn't turn out to be true. And in any case, I do not believe Vladimir Putin is ready for war with Europe, the official claimed. The official went on to state that his opinion doesn't mean that Russia isn't producing large amounts of military equipment. Russia might even have the military and economic capability to wage war against NATO. But waging war and winning a war are two very different things. The reason is that he knows NATO will defend itself, and even if he has the capability to wage war, he doesn't have the capability to win. The official says of Putin knowing that Russia doesn't win if it tangles with NATO. And most importantly, I believe Putin understands that NATO is now incredibly united in defending its allies. In this article, Coughlin adds that the state of Russia's troops right now, in addition to how Russia has fared in Ukraine, also points to the fact that Russia can fight a war with NATO, but it can't win one. Coughlin points to the Russian military's inherent weakness, especially when it comes to the quality of the country's soldiers and Russia's ability to keep those soldiers equipped. We've seen an example of these types of struggles in Lyman, where Putin is sending his soldiers to fight without helmets, body armor, or even the most basic equipment. These kinds of issues are indicative of major problems in Russia's military, both in terms of supply and philosophy, that we explored in a video covering the helmet issue. Watch that video if you want to learn more. These very issues are what makes Russia such a poor match for NATO. After all, it's this philosophy that has also led to Russia waging a predominantly ground-based attritional war that has seen itself become the victim of the attrition it's trying to inflict on Ukraine. Putin tries to act as though Russia is winning the Ukraine war to such an extent that Ukraine's loss is inevitable. The opposite is the case, Coughlin points out. The Russian military may have made some marginal gains in eastern Ukraine, but they have been achieved at a terrible cost in terms of Russian casualties. These comments were echoed by the UK's politico-military counsellor, Ankur Narayan, in a November speech delivered in Vienna. Narayan points out that Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine's territory. That's unimpressive enough on its own, given that Russia has waged war against Ukraine for almost 4 years. However, Narayan points out that Russia has gained just 1.1% of that territory since the Ukraine war's front lines stabilized back in November 2022. The rest was either held before Russia launched its invasion, as the country had already annexed Crimea, or was gained during the initial days of the invasion before Russia was pushed back. About 1% of Ukraine gained in 3 years is a terrible number, and it's come at great cost to Russia in both equipment and manpower. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia has lost over 1.17 million soldiers to death, injury, or capture since the war began. On the equipment front, more than 11,300 tanks, over 23,600 armored fighting vehicles, and almost 35,000 artillery systems have been reduced to dust. Russia may be building more weapons, but the sheer scale of these losses raises the question of just how ready Russia can really be if it enters a war with Europe's NATO members. Ukraine is relatively small when compared to almost all of Europe, and the grinding approach that Putin has taken in Ukraine simply wouldn't work without costing Russia so much in terms of manpower, equipment, and money that the country collapses. It's here where Trump comes into play. Coughlin's main point in this article is that Putin is trying to trick the US into believing that he oversees a version of Russia that simply doesn't exist. Russia's leader has been using that trickery through his threats since the beginning of the war. The tricks even worked on the Biden administration, Coughlin suggests. Other tricks include claiming that Russia is doing better in Ukraine than it really is, and the most recent claim that Russia is both ready for a war with Europe and NATO and that Russia would easily win that war. Trump shouldn't fall for any of these tricks. And Coughlin says that there are encouraging signs that he won't. The Telegraph's writer mentions that Trump has been implementing tougher sanctions against Russia's oil companies due to Putin's refusal to agree to a peace deal. The US is also well aware of the increasingly precarious domestic position in which Putin finds himself, and the Trump administration has shown itself to be no stranger to throwing America's military might around. For instance, the Trump administration's choice to use a B-2 bomber to lead the flyover when Putin visited Alaska was akin to the types of intimidation tactics that Putin is very familiar with using. There have already been encouraging signs that the US President Donald Trump, far from being intimidated by Putin, is more than willing to play him at his own game, Coughlin writes. And his main point is simple. Trump can not only play Putin at his own game, but with the support of America's NATO allies, he could make Putin realize that Russia would lose this game. Far from being ready for a war with NATO, Russia stands to lose any fight that occurs. And the numbers back that up, as NATO has greater firepower than Russia across the board, assuming that Trump throws America's full military weight into a fight with Russia. The Week highlights this in a June article where it examines who would win a war between Russia and NATO. Putin won't like the numbers. NATO has over 3.4 million active duty soldiers, along with the potential to call up many millions more. Russia's 1.3 to 1.5 million active soldiers don't compare. Russia's stockpile of around 4,000 to 5,000 aircraft is dwarfed by NATO bringing a combined roughly 22,000 aircraft to the war. NATO's navy is around 4 times the size of Russia's, and even in areas where Russia excels, such as in tanks and armored vehicles, NATO's numbers dwarf Russia's every single time. For instance, more than 131,000 armored vehicles Russia supposedly has in its stockpiles are nothing compared to NATO's collective of over 970,000. Ironically, the only advantage that Russia might have in a conventional war comes from drones. Ukraine has used drones to great effect against Russia, which has forced Russia to build its own drone army. NATO has to play catch-up in that department, and is looking to do so through the creation of a drone wall that mitigates the Russian unmanned aerial vehicle threat. But that's the only conventional department in which Russia wins, and even that advantage would slip if NATO went into war mode and started building drones by the millions. Of course, there's also the non-conventional war to consider. Putin and his cronies are more than happy to throw Russia's nuclear weight around. but it seems to do so while believing that NATO couldn't do the same if it wanted. The Arms Control Association points out that the US alone has almost as many nukes as Russia, with a disparity of around 300, meaning little when both countries have over 5,000 warheads stockpiled, including retired warheads. Throw France and the UK into the mix, which deliver 290 and 225 nukes to NATO's stockpiles respectively, and NATO is in a position where it can call Putin's bluff on the nuclear front too. NATO's significant advantage over Russia, assuming all members of the group act as one, is enough to provide Trump with the leverage he needs to ignore Putin's threats during peace negotiations. Why not send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, for example? That's another red line being crossed that will probably result in Russia doing nothing. Weigh Russia down with more sanctions, Coughlin argues, and ensure those sanctions are properly enforced. By calling Putin's bluff, Trump and NATO can show Russia's leader that he doesn't have the leverage he believes that he has over the Ukraine war peace discussions. As Coughlin puts it, if Trump is really serious about ending this dreadful conflict, then he must understand that Putin will only agree to a peace deal when he finally realizes that he has no other viable option but to end his special military operation to conquer Ukraine. It's time for NATO to play a game of mine is bigger than yours. NATO wins every single time. And even with Russia's nuclear threat, there's no guarantee that Putin will trust his own missiles to deliver warheads against an enemy. That's particularly the case for the Sarmat missile, which is meant to be Russia's big hitter that is capable of hitting any country on the planet. But Russia's unstoppable missile can barely make it off the ground. The Sarmat has exploded in Putin's face, literally, and Russia's leader is trying to hide his embarrassment. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments as tensions rise between Russia and NATO. And thank you for watching.